Joel completely locks up because what he's staring at is not a person like he initially thought, but a demon, as he describes. In tonight's episode, I'm going to share with you one of the most disturbing nights out in the woods. Get ready. This story was submitted to me by the brother of the eyewitness who helped him type it all out. Back in 2018, on a hot, humid July day in West Virginia, Joel, Adam, and Justin decided to go on a weekend camping trip up in the Appalachian Mountains. They were to start at Shavers Fork River and work their way up Stone Cold Run. Once reaching about 2 miles upstream, this is where they would establish camp. Joel, Adam, and Justin had been lifelong best friends and were looking at spending a weekend together, camping, hiking, and fishing. Keep in mind that these names were changed at the request of the story submitter. Once they reached Shavers Fork, they pulled over, got everything out, and decided to make the long trek up Stone Cold Run. Fortunately, their camp wasn't very far off from the end of Stone Cold Run. This way they can go down and fetch water when they needed. While the weather was beautiful, and the forest was alive with all sorts of noises and critters, they had made some unsettling discoveries along the way. On the 2-mile trek up to their campsite, they had found 3 dead ruffed grouse. Each one looked like it had exploded, or like something had grabbed hold of it and squeezed it so hard that it popped. None of them were close together. They were all found separate. While the bird carcasses appeared to be more than a day old, there appeared to be no signs of maggots or other forms of decay. Joel, Adam, and Justin thought this was strange because there's nothing natural that would cause a bird to die like this, and to find 3 separate ones just left like that, even though they thought it strange, they continued to press on and go towards camp, forgetting about it, leaving it in the past. Once they had reached the perfect clearing for their camp spot nestled in the mountainous terrain, their clearing sat on a spot among some old oak and hickory trees. To the right of the clearing, facing north, would be a thick patch of brush and red spruce and maple trees. To the left towards the river was more red spruce and maple and birch all scattered throughout the area. And once they decided to settle down, they did what any campers would do. They began collecting kindling, setting up their 10-man tent. They began to really take in the lush, beautiful scenery that surrounded them. Hiking in it and up it is one thing, but when you finally get to sit and relax, take in a breath of fresh air, and look around you, and just take in the scenery, it's a whole different experience. The rest of that afternoon was spent relaxing and finalizing getting all the camp set up, tired from the strenuous hike of carrying all their gear up to this very spot. As dusk began approaching, they knew they would need to collect more water for the evening. So, they decided that all 3 of them should go hike down to the stream below the Stone Cold Run and collect some water and hike back up to the camp. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is that they also noted that during the afternoon, before dusk had even arrived, they noticed there would be times in the afternoon when the sounds around them would stop altogether. And while it wasn't necessarily off-putting at first, it was strange, because here they are relaxing, the birds chirping, the forest alive like it should be in the middle of summer in the mountains, and then for everything to just stop dead silent didn't make any sense, only to resume just a few moments later. And this went on and off for the entirety of the afternoon, going into evening time. As they're making their way down to Stone Cold Run, they noticed an odor hitting them in the face upwind. They explained the odor as a mixture of rotting flesh, garbage, and wet dog. But from their location, they could not make out any visible signs or indicators as to what the smell was coming from. Once they had made it down by the stream, they began getting their water, when they could see right across from them, sprawled out on one of the rocks right near the stream, was a dead wild boar. Upon further inspection, this wasn't a boar that had just died, but a boar with its throat torn out, its eyeballs removed, and its innards missing. Adam even made note that it looked like something punched a hole into its abdomen and disemboweled it. The kill also looked very fresh and could not be any older than 3 to 4 hours. Had no smell whatsoever, but the condition in which the carcass was found did not sit right with these guys. And as they're sitting there observing this carcass and what could have killed it, that awful odor comes back and slaps them all right in the nostrils. And they realize that the odor is not coming from this boar carcass, but whatever it is right in the vicinity of where they're at. That same rotting flesh, blood, wet dog, garbage smell is back again. And accompanying the odor is what they described as a bad feeling. So they simply got their water, made their way back to camp, and just try to do their best to shake it off. While they did spend a little bit of time talking about it and wondering back and forth amongst themselves what could have killed it, why was it laid there like that, all their troubles were soon forgotten after they began stuffing their faces with a great dinner and pouring some whiskey. As they were each sipping on their whiskey, they even wondered if there was any connection between the dead ruffed grouse and this boar, since they were both killed in very bizarre, barbaric ways. But pretty soon, as the booze begins to take hold of them, they soon forget about all the troubles and any anxieties they've had in this trip so far. And the rest of the evening becomes a blast for them. I mean, they're having a great time, they begin playing cards, they're joking, they're laughing. This is the most fun they've had in quite some time. I'm told that they didn't drink all that much because within about 2 or 3 hours, the booze is wearing off, and they're kind of growing tired. Because at this point, it's about midnight, maybe getting closer to about 1 in the morning, and they're getting ready to turn in to start the next day. And they begin to climb into the tent where they start to argue amongst themselves about Adam or Joel probably moving each other's things, because Adam had moved his sleeping equipment on top of Justin's stuff, and they were kind of just bickering back and forth when Joel immediately shh, telling them to be quiet and to listen. And so Adam and Justin are looking back at Joel, confused, exchanging glances, not sure what to think, when Joel is saying, "Do you guys hear that?" And as they listened, the night outside was quiet. There were no crickets chirping, there was no sounds at all. It was just dead silent. You could hear a pin drop from a mile away. Now they're even more confused, unsure of what Joel had heard when they hear it, and it sounds like someone is coming their way. Perhaps another hiker or a vagabond. But why anybody would be approaching their campsite after dark could only either mean desperation or trouble. As the crunching began to get louder, they noticed it odd, the pattern of footsteps that this person seemed to be taking. Like they would take a couple steps, they would stop, take a couple more steps, they would stop, perhaps drunk. Then, that's when they began to smell that same old odor as before down by the Stone Coal Run. Only this time, there is a very distinctive iron metallic smell with it, which also is commonly described for the smell of blood. All these guys are pretty well armed. I mean, Joel's got his .357, Adam and Justin have their .44. Seems a bit excessive to bring into the woods, right? I mean, unless you're fighting off a grizzly bear, you really don't need to use a .44 in most cases. But really, I guess Adam and Justin just felt like they wanted the extra protection. And so they're each sitting there with the revolvers in hand, ready to go, just quiet, listening, waiting for the sounds to come back. Because now the sounds have stopped, and there's nothing. There's no sounds coming from anywhere now, and the sounds that were coming towards their tent have now stopped, and so they're sitting there waiting for the sounds to reappear again. And all of a sudden, sounds re-emerge right behind their tent, and they had somehow moved from the section of woods near their tent now behind their tent. And the sound that erupts is this sniffing noise, like a large dog, followed by this deep huffing noise. And this is no more than 5-10 feet away from the backside of their tent, which is no more than about 10 to 15 yards away from the tree line. And all they hear is this deep, raspy, guttural breathing, this but much slower, drawn out, and very labored. So they're all looking at each other inside the tent, revolvers in hand, ready to go, and nobody knows what they should do first. Do they make the first contact, go outside the tent, and start firing? Do they wait until whatever's out there tries to get in the tent? What do? They were just waiting for the right moment to act. And just like before, everything stops, and so now here we are yet again with all of them staring at each other, unsure of what to do, until they begin to talk amongst themselves, deciding what they should do next. Joel then decides that it's in his best interest if he goes out there by himself, because perhaps he can catch whoever is out there completely unarmed and off guard. So as he slowly approaches the tent door, he reaches out and just very slowly undoes the tent flap, making sure not to make too much noise, revolver still in hand by the way, and he gets it about halfway. And when the tent flap is about halfway, if you know how any tents are, the tent flap kind of sways back and forth like an open cat door. And because of this, you have to reach your hand and either grab it this way or push it out. And because he doesn't want to take the extra time or risk making too much noise to open it all the way open, he decides that he's just going to stick his leg out, stick his body underneath, and kind of just peek around with his flashlight and his revolver just to try and get a sense of what's going on. He's got his flashlight in hand, he's got his revolver in the other hand, so he slowly puts his leg right outside the door, sticks his hand underneath the flap, and as he's coming up underneath the flap while shining his light up, his eyes immediately lock on with whatever his flashlight is illuminating from about 20 feet away. Joel completely locks up because what he's staring at is not a person like he initially thought, but a demon, as he describes. The details he would give were very vague, but he described it as skeletal, sunken-in features, bright yellow eyes, tall pointed ears, and a snout, and it stood there perfectly still, revealing a large row of teeth, letting out a slow and dangerous hiss as a way to warn Joel, do not come any closer. And before Joel could even blink, he is yanked back into the tent by Adam, who looks back over at Joel and is asking him, "What did you see?" But Joel is completely dumbfounded, just stuttering, not even sure how to process the animal in which he just saw. Interrupting their conversation is a deep hiss that comes right up to the tent. But Adam is now shining his flashlight toward the tent flap, but the tent flap is open slightly, so there is light spilling out. Even while being extremely armed, there's nothing that can prepare you for a moment like that. And it was at this moment, all of them are aiming their flashlights towards the flap of the tent with their guns pointed, expecting this thing to burst through the tent flap and grab at them. They each knew at this point they were not dealing with a person, but some sort of animal. And once again, the night around them went quiet. No crickets, no sounds of anything. Whatever animal this was simply toying with them. They were completely unsure of what to do in this situation, having never experienced anything like this in their lives. They understood their weekend plans were now foiled, and survival was far a greater commodity. Now they began arguing amongst themselves what to do and how to handle the situation, unsure if they should just retreat now and risk fighting this thing in the darkness, or sit there and wait till sunrise, when they hear another loud crash from the woodline on the side of the tent this time, and they can hear whatever it was now barreling, coming right towards the side of their tent, and they were convinced this thing was going to tear right through the tent wall. It all happened so quick, they moved to shine their light and the revolver when the noise again stops right by the tent door. And then they hear the hissing again over by the front flap moving. And they realize now, there's not one of these things, there's multiple of them. They could be potentially dealing with a pack of these unknown predators. And now, the stakes are higher than ever. And so finally, Adam, fed up with all of this, gets up from the spot, grabs his flashlight and says, "You know what, I'm done, I'm not taking this anymore, I'm gonna figure this out." And he bolts out of the tent with Joel and Justin saying, "No, wait, come back, don't leave." And they can hear Adam running towards the stream, and he fires off a shot of his .44. And what followed after is the most inhuman scream either Joel or Justin have ever heard. What we could only assume is that Adam had fired at one of these creatures. Joel and Justin were completely petrified and felt their only option at this point was to wait till sunrise instead of risking going out there in the darkness. And so that's exactly what they did, unsure if Adam was now even alive or if he'd ever even make it back. They sat there, hopped up on adrenaline, keeping their lights shown at the tent flap and their guns aimed. It was easily the most terrifying and exhausting few hours either of them would ever have to endure. And just as the sun had finally begun to break in the sky, they realized that their only chance would be to make a break for it, and there was no time to break down camp and to collect all their things. They would have to come back at a later time during the day and do that. However, Justin refused to even leave the tent unless it was bright enough. So once it came to about 6 a.m., they decided they were going to make a mad dash down back to their vehicle, bolt out of the tent, and don't even look back. They just start running in the direction they came. And not even a half-mile away, they find Adam, who's resting up against a tree, clutching his shoulder, and he's bleeding very badly. And when they go to grab Adam, they realize that he's not dead, he's just very in and out of consciousness. And at this point, he's lost a lot of blood, and they look like pretty deep gash marks. But fortunately, he's still coherent enough that he's able to stand up and kind of hobble along with them all along the way back down to their vehicle. The entire way down, Joel claims that they were followed, and that he knew just beyond the tree line, these things were waiting and watching. Once they had made it back down to their vehicle, they had to drive over an hour to the closest hospital, it being the Webster County Memorial Hospital, about 50 plus miles away. Adam was fortunately able to get his arm stitched up and taken care of, but when asked by medical personnel, he could simply not explain the wounds away. And they explained they did not appear to be made by a bear, And so once the afternoon came, Justin had to drive all the way back themselves, hike back up the 2 miles to their campsite during the afternoon in broad daylight to collect their camp gear and pack everything back down. As much as they didn't want to, they had no choice, and the entire time they knew they were being watched. Adam had refused to go back, so it was just Joel and Justin this time. And while this isn't the most horrendous situation out in the woods, it's definitely pretty traumatizing for somebody like Adam. It's an event that neither him nor Adam and Justin really talk about to this day at all, and Adam still refuses to talk about what he saw or what he shot at. It also took Joel quite a bit of time to process these events and really come to terms with what had happened before he could sit down and work with his brother to help write the story out and get it into words. Is all the years out there he spent hunting boar and rabbit and white-tailed deer, he's never seen anything like what he saw that evening. A being that he refuses to give more description to because it has terrified him so greatly. Beings that he simply summarizes as a pack of demons. This next story was submitted to me by a man who calls himself Jim, and he shared a terrifying account of being nearly abducted by what he believes to have been a thunderbird at the age of 5. Right around 1969, Jim was approximately 5 years of age when this took place. Jim and his family lived on a farm in Hickman, Kentucky. This farm was towards the edge of town, near a wild area where they would often go hunting before several of these areas would be preserved and off-limits to hunting, turning into national park areas. Like any farm, they had crops and plenty of livestock. But just beyond the reach of the farm was a stream, and Jim had been out to the stream before, but only with his father, uncle, or grandfather. He was never allowed to go by himself because he was too short and could not be seen beyond the bushes and the fencing. So the rule was that he was not allowed to go beyond the cotton field. Being a kid, what does he do? He goes beyond the fence, down to the stream, and he has the time of his life. He's chasing and catching frogs, he's catching salamanders and turtles, just a kid being a kid. And he's even having so much fun, he does not realize just how dark his surroundings are starting to get. Sundown is quickly approaching. Jim, not wanting to get the old switch across the butt, climbs up the bank of the stream up to a larger clearing where the road was only about 100 yards away at that point to lead back to the house. After wiping off the dust and burrs, he notices something not right. An enormous shadow was beginning to slowly come right up behind him. Immediately, he's thinking to himself, I'm busted. I'm about to get whacked. However, the shadow keeps growing and eventually casts itself over his entire body. Puzzled, as he turns and looks up into the sky, what he sees does not make sense. It's a giant mass of dark feathers and wings, bigger than a large dog. Jim ran like he was on fire, diving into a nearby bush, and this thing was unrelenting. Right behind him, he scratched his leg pretty bad and screamed. He looks up and sees this massive bird eye looking right at him through the bush, violently clawing at the bush, trying its best to try and grab him. And finally, one of the clawed talons actually claws into his back because he couldn't possibly go any lower than what he was. And as soon as it pierced his back, he let out this agonizing scream. Feeling momentarily defeated, this bird could not grab its prey. Jim described them in detail for me. It was dark gray, and that the eyes reminded him of a turkey vulture because there were so many all around that area, but a face that looked nothing like it. He mentioned that it was not all completely feathers, and he could see skin and a dark red spot looking like a shield on its chest. Its legs were also dark and with very large talons, and the eyes were easily as big as a melon. The face was not all feathers either. It was skin and color like spots or patches. The beak was curved and very sharp looking, just like that of a hawk's. It also had dried blood around its nostrils, and it reeked of rotting dead animals. Jim just began screaming as loud as he could, crying and scared. He didn't know what to do. Unfortunately, his grandfather and uncles had heard him, and they came running over. And as they're running down the road, all they see is this massive bird as big as or larger than a person tearing into this bush, desperate for its next meal. Jim's Uncle Joe runs back to the house, while Jim's grandfather and other uncle began looking around frantically for something to throw at this bird, when all of a sudden, the one circling in the sky lets out a shriek, calling to the other one on the ground, and the one trying to eat Jim leaves, and they both take off to the northwest, but not before being shot at by his Uncle Joe from down the road. Jim had also mentioned that you could hear branches breaking for a while and cracking as these large birds tried to perch. Jim was then brought inside by his grandfather and uncles, and his wounds were looked at thoroughly by his grandmother, who informed him they were very deep, but they would heal. She put this stuff on his back that stank and turned out to be the same stuff they would use on cattle at the time when they got barbed wire cuts. The doctor would later use a patch that healed it. And not sure what else to do, the family decided to call the sheriff. The grandfather and uncles explained precisely what had happened, that these two massive birds were trying to abduct their grandson. He went into detail just how large and terrifying these things were, and that their wingspan was as large as a truck. The sheriff just made it simple and explained that he would give them the same two options he gave Mrs. Johnson from down the hill. Her farm was 2 miles away, close enough to experience the same activity. She claimed that she witnessed her dog fall out of the sky and die by hitting the pond. She was worried no one would believe her. The sheriff explained that she declined to file a complaint, and that maybe you should too. The county may think little Jim's injury might be caused by a family member and sound like they're covering it due to the nature and description of a car-sized bird. It also rained very badly after this happened. Jim's grandfather was also full-blooded Cherokee and claimed the birds they saw that day were thunderbirds. However, he called them by their Cherokee name, which Jim forgets. In Cherokee, Carolina, they would go to the cliffs after it had rained and find many baby and children bones. So they began tying children and babies to their backs while they worked, because the women could simply not fight these birds off while they would come swooping down and taking their children. Even the Ojibwe natives had their own name for this being, and they called it the Wakinyan. Jim then further discussed the similarities between his experience and the Marlon Lowe case. Probably one of the only actual eyewitness documentation of a young boy being nearly abducted by two larger-than-life, dark-colored birds in Illinois in 1977. Marlon Lowe was only 10 at the time and managed to escape the clutches of one of these birds who had firmly had him in its grasp. What's even more astounding about this case is that there were 7 total eyewitnesses, all corroborating the same thing, and the incident was so wild that it made the news, which resulted in Marlon and his mother being mocked by the community. The birds were written off as turkey vultures, which is ridiculous considering the neighborhood of Lawndale, Illinois had lots of turkey vultures in at the time, and at the same time, they are big, and nowhere big enough to take off with a 60-pound child in its claws. So, how do you explain away what 7 different eyewitnesses saw that day? Is it possible that there are enormous birds yet unknown to science somewhere in North America? Or are these potentially supernatural? Just as many native tribes have talked about, bringing forth rain and storms, further bringing life to Jim's story. One thing is for sure, there are things out there that we cannot explain. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to go ahead and hit that like button, leave a comment down below, and slap that subscribe button. And keep a lookout because I got some great new content coming your way very soon.